within the LAF to play a meaningful role in the future. Whether or not dollars spent through IMET, FMF, and so on are going to be existing on forward through the LAF over 5 years, 10 years, and having meaningful impact in terms of institutional culture. That still hasn't really moved in the direction that we would like to see. There is also a cultural challenge, and by cultural I mean a military cultural challenge in terms of mission design and military development. It's very hard for the military in Lebanon to think in terms of long-term strategic planning, because for the last 5 years, the overarching mission within the mind's eye of the LAF command has been to mitigate crisis, to manage crisis, and to try and stay ahead of the curve. And they view looking at 2013 or 2015 as a luxury. There's also a gap between the realities of short-term procurement and long-term sustainment. The LAF wants everything yesterday, partly because we're starting in many ways from scratch, but also because they view their optics development on the ground, their development in terms of capability, as something they need to mature up to in a short period of time. But the counterpoint is that that does not translate, if it were to happen, into meaningful military development. If tomorrow the US or any country were to provide the LAF with heavy systems, for example, fixed-wing aircraft, they would become essentially what are known as hangar queens. Inability to fly, inability to field, inability to maintain. You would basically have a situation where the LAF says, we want this, but when they get it, limited buy-in and limited ability to utilize, let alone any missions in cooperation with ground forces. There's also a big shortfall in terms of navigating the US security assistance maze. This is just a basic FMS sales process. And when I say basic, it doesn't look basic. I had to go to DISAM to learn what this is. The important thing to remember is that within the context of the LAF, this process, while not completely alien, is not entrenched within a succinct structure. You don't have a lot of LAF personnel who can provide this kind of buy-in and knowledge. Sure, there have been teams out to Lebanon to train LAF personnel, and you see here the numbers. When you look at Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, you can't really factor in the numbers from 2008 yet, but if you look at the trending, Lebanon's neighbors have a much clearer understanding of the institution of security assistance as a whole. And the personnel that were trained in 2008, as far as I know, and as far as has been confirmed to me, a lot of the personnel who have been trained in 2008 are not allocated to actual security assistance-related processes. Again, the point about training going nowhere. In 2009, no training. 2010, there seems to be a greater understanding and sophistication within the US security assistance community about this problem, and they're going to address it. It's also important to bear in mind that it's not just about a process, it's also about understanding who the players in the US are. And the Lebanese have fundamentally been unable to navigate the US assistance maze. There are a number of institutions, all the way from the top, right down to the AO level, implementing security assistance. Most countries, such as Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, Israel, understand this process, have personnel who are allocated to deal with such a process, who are based in the US or at least come to the United States, who have a knowledge of security assistance and are able to navigate the maze, be it the institutional segment, the leadership segment, or the congressional. It's also important to bear in mind that there is a stagnation in terms of overall defense expenditures. It's very nice to talk about military development in Lebanon. It's something else altogether to budget for it. And when you adjust for inflation over the last 15 to 20 years, there hasn't been any meaningful budgeting towards meaningful military development in Lebanon. Even the numbers here are misleading. The LAF since fiscal year 2005 has been operating on the 2005 defense budget. Every year a proposal is made, no decision is taken on it, they revert back to the 2005 budget. There's also a significant challenge in terms of the civil political environment in Lebanon. Lebanese actors perceive power as a zero-sum game. If I were to gain leverage in Lebanon as an actor, operating in Lebanon, that means, from my perspective, that you have lost some of that power and vice versa. There is no perception that power can be spread across the political spectrum. In many ways, this informs civil-military relations. If you have a military like the LAF, that, for example, in 58 does not follow the decisions of a government for reasons, be they logical or not, it informs how the political sphere evaluates and interprets the LAF's position vis-a-vis the political sphere. So you have a situation where you've had a struggle over the role of the military in Lebanon, and also a struggle to control the military or to mitigate its usefulness one way or the other in the political spectrum, depending on what the current of the day is. The post-2005 period basically sees an unfreezing of the struggle over post-Ta'if Lebanon. Again, it's important not to look at Lebanon solely through the lens of a post-9/11 paradigm. It's important to look at Lebanese civil-military relations, military development, as something that emanates from the essentially independence Lebanon, from 43 onwards, not just in terms of counterterrorism and Hezbollah. You have a gap in Lebanon between the military and civilians. You have foreign policy fragmentation. You don't have a unified command structure that can dictate policy. You have basically a state of political anarchy, not unlike that of the international system, whereby actors, be they subnational political parties, sectarian groups, or the military itself, are essentially part of an archipelago of players that utilize back channels of communication in order to keep tabs on one another, rather than utilizing institutional channels for meaningful civil-military relations. You also have a byproduct, which is incomplete information. One of the remarkable things you see when you're in my position and you're dealing with a lot of the leadership and with the LAF is that there is a gap of knowledge between civilian leadership, be they in office or not, and the LAF as an institution. And that's part of the process of the zero-sum game in Lebanon, but also a byproduct of these atrophied and back-channel political discussions. You also have, as I mentioned, the budgetary challenge. It's viewed as a burden that many political leaders are not willing to undertake. And there are reasons for that that I can go into in the Q&A. Let's just jump through some of these slides. This has an impact on how the LAF does decision making. You have a situation where, in an ideal context, the LAF would evaluate its needs, what the costs are, what kind of systems it has, what's available, and would just go ahead with procurement, allocate US funding or other funding, and also national funds. But ultimately, and this is just one strategic planning model, there are many, but ultimately the question that I often ask myself is, how does one define Lebanese national purpose? How does one define common Lebanese national interests or strategic vision? And the reality, unfortunately, is that given you have foreign policy fragmentation and you have basically a state of anarchy in the political system, it's very difficult to have an environment where the LAF can actually go ahead and do meaningful long-term planning, meaningful long-term development. Now we get to the end. Again, I'm trying to keep this below my 90 slide mark. The pros of US security assistance are that, first of all, there is limited risk. The LAF has an excellent end-use monitoring track record. It is by far the most reliable military in the region when it comes to accounting for every ounce of military assistance it's received from the United States. And this is a long-term track record, not just in terms of the last 4 or 5 years. And the US security assistance and security cooperation community also looks at Lebanon as a country where they don't really have to worry about end-use monitoring, where the real concern comes from Congress and from the overall sphere that evaluates what kind of assistance Lebanon is receiving, not so much from the implementers themselves.